Now, I haven't got a specific reading today because we're actually going back to where we were last week. If you remember last week, we studied Abraham. And it seemed only fair to think about Sarah, his wife. So I'm hoping you remember, most of you anyway, what we thought about as we studied. Sarah has quite an extraordinary story, which is not always kept up front. Abraham is the one that is remembered. In fact, this morning I was listening to Radio Scotland, and they were having a discussion, and the man was talking about the Abrahamic faiths. So poor Sarah, although she was the mother of Isaac, no one calls it this, what would it be? Saranic faith? Who knows? But sometimes Sarah can seem a little bit like a footnote, and yet she was so important to this story. Without Sarah, there is no Isaac. Without Sarah, there is no fulfillment of the promise. Sarah has obviously got a very important part to play. Sarah also had quite an interesting life. I don't know if you remember some of the things we talked about, but it wouldn't have been easy for her. She travelled along with Abraham. We remember Abraham's journey, but Sarah was there too. In fact, today we're going to follow it a little bit. Now, I hope you can see. I've got one of these cool pointer thingies today, so we'll see. And I'll probably blind you with it when I'm playing. So the journey of Sarah and Abraham. Down the bottom right-hand corner, you can see Ur, in what we would call Babylonia, in the old days then anyway, Iraq. And so Sarah was with Abraham in Ur. We find out later she's actually his half-sister. They shared a father, not a mother. Now, that just goes to show that not everything in the Bible is to be imitated. Okay? It was okay then, not okay now. So Abraham and Sarah, or Sarai and Abram, as they were known in those days, they travelled together with Terah, Abram's father, and the rest of the family, and they travelled, let me see if I can work it. Oh yes, all the way up here. Watch this, they followed all the way up here. Oh, I'm loving this. To Haran. Now, when I first looked at it, I thought, they're trying to get to here, but they go up here. Can you see why they probably do that? Yeah, follow the green. Follow the green. So they follow the Euphrates River for quite a long way up through to Haran. I suspect if you went through the middle, then you wouldn't last long. I wonder what way the wise men went years and years and years later. Is that a similar route that they took from the east? And so they go to Haran, and the family stop there. They stay in Haran. And Terah decides that's as far as he's going. So the Lord comes to Abraham, or Abram as he was then, and he says, no, you're going to keep going. Now, maybe Sarah thought, well, we've already walked a long way. Won't this do? But she's faithful to her husband, and she continues. She believes the promise that God makes to Abraham. She believes the promise that they will have children. Do you remember that? Abraham was 75 then, so Sarah's 65 years old probably at this point. But she believes the promise that God will make them parents, and that they will be the father and mother of a great nation, or many nations. And so they follow the blue arrow. They travel down all the way. There's mountains, there's Syria, down through Canaan. But they don't stop there. I think there's famine, and so they end up in Egypt. Do you remember what happens in Egypt? Yeah, so I don't know if Abraham's just a wise man, or whether Sarah was absolutely stunning, but he says, you're so beautiful, my love, that I'm concerned that the Pharaoh's going to want to take you as a wife. So you pretend that you're my sister so he doesn't kill me. Now remember, Abraham's the father of faith. But that was a bit of a fearful move, wasn't it? Abraham has travelled probably thousands of miles because God told him to. But now he thinks, they'll probably kill me because my wife is so beautiful and take her. So we'll say she's my sister. And she becomes a wife of Pharaoh. That's how it worked in the old days. Imagine that. Imagine who you'd have to marry now. So Pharaoh takes Sarah to be his wife. And I was thinking, imagine all the things that entails. I'm not sure Sarah got a great deal or much say in the matter, did she? But she follows Abraham's faithless idea. And God brings chaos and calamity on the house of Egypt, on the king of Egypt. And so eventually it comes out that this is actually Abraham's wife, and he sends them off with gifts. And I suspect this is where Hagar is picked up as a servant or a slave to Sarah and Abraham. They travel back up to Canaan. All this time, decades now, Sarah has not been able to conceive. And I know how painful that can be today. Imagine how painful it was for her when that was literally what she was expected to do, to fulfill Abraham's need to continue his family. And not only that, imagine the pressure when God has said it too. So it's not just that her husband wanted children when she was probably 75 by now. It's that God has said she will provide a family to Abraham. Can you imagine the pressure she lived under? And I wonder if that's part of what was behind her suggestion. Now, she suggests to Abraham that he takes Hagar as essentially a wife as well, and that through Hagar a child will be provided. That's not as weird as it sounds. Again, not okay today. But in Mesopotamian law, that was allowed. And so, I'm not sure again did Abraham jump at the chance? Had it been on his mind anyway? Or was he talked into it? But people sometimes give Sarah a bad press for that. But you've got to remember, she was under this extreme pressure to produce a child, to help fulfill the promises of God. And again, Abraham probably could have said no. Abraham gets off lightly in this discussion. Again, Abraham could have said, nah, out of respect to you, I'm not going to do that. But he does it. When Hagar gets pregnant, as you can imagine, that causes a lot of tension between Sarah and Hagar. There'll be envy and jealousy, as you can imagine. Whenever there is polygamy in the Old Testament, one, God didn't want them to do that. That wasn't the way that he created things to be. And two, it always causes chaos. So if you ever wonder, well, why does God just not destroy them all when they get involved in polygamy? He lets them live out the judgment. The whole Old Testament is full of jealousy, murder, hatred, the destruction of families, the destruction of legacies. People don't fulfill the promises that they might have fulfilled, or they don't fulfill them as easily or as well as they would have, because of polygamy. So God leaves them in it, but he also lets them live out the judgment of living like that. And so Hagar runs away because it's become so unpleasant for her to be around Sarah. But God sends her back, and God makes promises to her that her child will be important too, and important to him. But he won't be the child of the promise. Now, we talked last week about the visit from 3 people visit. One is an embodiment of God. The others, we believe, are angels. They tell Abraham he is going to be a father still through Sarah. Abraham thinks that's funny when it's announced to Sarah, or in Sarah's earshot because she's listening in. She finds that funny. Before the promise is fulfilled, Abraham has a son through Hagar, Ishmael. And Ishmael's quite a bit older, at least I think about 10 years older or more, probably a teenager when Isaac's born. But even before that happens, Abraham hasn't learned his lesson. He goes to a place now, I'm going to get this wee thing, hold on. He goes to a place called Gerar when he's coming back up. So he's coming back up from Egypt. See this place? Sure, so when they're already here, this is where Hagar runs to. So she's pregnant and she travels quite a long distance. Okay? And so they're back up this way. And they're at Gerar. And Abimelech is the leader there. And again, Abraham hadn't learned his lesson. So he says to Sarah, they're going to kill me because you're so beautiful and they want to take you as their wife, the leader will, so let's pretend you're my sister again. Sometimes the patriarchs sound pretty stupid, don't they? This is a man that God talks to. Abraham has faith, which is an example to all of us, but he still makes really dumb decisions and he doesn't learn his lesson. And so, thanks to God this time, the king, Abimelech, is given a dream by God and informed that this is actually not Abraham's sister, it's his wife. And that's good, because otherwise there would have been questions over the lineage of Isaac, wouldn't there? All of a sudden, she has a son after being given to somebody else. And so, again, they are sent packing once this king realizes this is actually Abraham's wife, and soon after, Isaac is born. Before that, the tension has been so great with Hagar. Oh, no, sorry, not before that. The tension gets so great with Hagar and Ishmael. There's competition. There's competition between the children. There's unpleasantness. Sarah says that there's mocking of her child. She complains to Abraham. Abraham says, do what you want. It's your servant, it's your slave. Do what you like. So she's horrible to her. And eventually she says, send them away. Get rid of them. Abraham doesn't want to do that. He obviously has love for Hagar and Ishmael. But he does. God tells him, you better do what your wife says. Good advice. Some great advice. And so, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away. But with God's blessing, God will bless Ishmael and Hagar and protect them. Hagar doesn't feature hugely after she has a kid. She has a kid at the age of 90. She lives another, let me get this right, 37 years and dies at the age of 127. I'm surprised she made it that long. She must have been worn out. In fact, she said that, didn't she, in the story? She says, how am I going to have a kid? I'm worn out in Abraham's ancient. You'll find the story in the middle of Genesis, if you want to have a look at it. But I want to think Abraham is often known as the father of faith. But I want to think about Sarah's role as the mother of faith, or maybe even the mother of faithfulness. There's two ways in this story that faithfulness is seen, and I want to think about them and what we might derive from them. What could we learn from the faithfulness of Sarah? The first one is her actual faithfulness. So, I know you wives love your husbands, and some of you have travelled thousands of miles with them. But if you think, how do you think Sarah felt at some of these junctures in the story? Think about how she was treated. She believes in the promise of God. She's faithful to Abraham, even though he often does things that are questionable. She believes in the promise of God, and she's faithful to Abraham because of that. But that involves her being handed over to the Pharaoh in what we would consider an exceptionally abusive situation now. It involves her being handed over to another man, again to protect Abraham's skin. Abraham is this great man of faith, and yet at times he showed such fearfulness. And Sarah went along with it. Now today you might criticize her for doing that. She should have spoken up. She should have said no. But again, how much choice does she have? And yet she remains faithful to Abraham. And in doing so, she's really remaining faithful to God. Sarah remains faithful to Abraham because she remains faithful to what God has said. Even probably when she knows better, even probably when she thinks her husband's making a mistake. In this story, she believes God's promise, and so she remains with him. We're told later in the New Testament something quite interesting. Let's see what you think of this. In 1 Peter, have a read of it. I'm glad we're not studying it today. But in 1 Peter, Sarah's faithfulness to Abraham in this situation is used by the letter as an example of godliness and holiness towards your husband. I think even if you don't agree, it's using as an example, even I think if your husband's wrong. So in the example that's specifically given is to wives of non-Christian husbands. So she's given as an example to those whose wives believe but husbands don't. And what it says, how Peter interprets Sarah's life is, he says, look at how Sarah lived. She didn't challenge Abraham. She didn't say things to him. She didn't shout at him. She didn't get angry with him. She faithfully lived a holy and godly life, and in that way she influenced him. And so the text suggests, and obviously it's quite specific, the text suggests that if you are a non-Christian, let's say husband as well, but if you're a non-Christian wife in a relationship if you're a Christian wife in a relationship with a non-Christian husband, rather than preaching at them, rather than trying to nag them into the kingdom, by your quiet holiness and godliness, you will win them over. And so, despite all the things that Sarah went through, her attitude towards God and towards Abraham is commended in the New Testament as an example of that relation. Now, I know that relationship could be abused. If you say to wives, you need to quietly and in a holy fashion work with your husband rather than trying to nag him into the kingdom or preach him into the kingdom. That can be abused. If you read on in 1 Peter, it says if husbands are abusive towards their wives in any way, then God won't hear their prayers. So it doesn't encourage husbands to be abusive. It doesn't encourage an abusive relationship. But in reverence to God, Sarah's behavior towards Abraham is commended. And one of the writers I was reading said, that's probably a good example to all of us in how to share our faith. Whether it's our family or our colleagues, any kind of long-term relationship, the suggestion is you're not going to preach folk into the kingdom that way. If you sit beside somebody at work or whatever, nagging them about the gospel, bringing it up all the time, you know the kind of Christian thing of like, well, that's funny you said that. That reminds me of a story about Jesus all the time. It's saying, surprisingly, it's saying, through your holiness and your decency, through your loving relationship and faithfulness to your colleagues and to others, you will win them for Christ, rather than nagging at them or always talking at them to try and make them believe what you believe. Now, I guess that might be relevant for some of us in a number of ways. And in our church and in the Church of Scotland in general, there are a lot of wives whose husbands aren't around at church. So maybe there is something there from you from 1 Peter. But anyway, the New Testament commends the faithfulness of Sarah, even when her husband wasn't right. I'm taking that. Peter's saying that if your husband isn't a Christian, he doesn't know the truth and he doesn't believe, then be like Sarah and through your loving, faithful holiness towards him. And so that's what's commended to us about Sarah. Loving, faithful, holy relationships, even when the other person is wrong or wrong-headed or acting out of fear. Just as an aside, in Abraham and Sarah's story, you see fear as the motivation for doing wrong or making bad decisions. So Sarah lied to God. Did you notice in the story, Sarah laughs in the tent because she hears them say she's going to be a mother and she's ancient. And God says to her, you laughed. Why did you laugh? And she said, I didn't laugh. Well, she survived. Imagine lying to God and surviving. That's amazing. So she laughed, but it said because she was afraid. Abraham twice hands his wife over to another man because he's afraid. Don't you think the God that's brought him all that way from Ur to Haran to Canaan to Egypt and back out, don't you think that God could have protected Abraham if Abraham had been honest? But Abraham is actually, as much as he said he loves his wife, he is willing to sacrifice his wife's well-being because he's afraid. So it's worth us thinking about what poor decisions have we made? What poor decisions do we make out of fear? And could we instead rely on the faithfulness of God? And it's the faithfulness of God I want to look at now. Sarah is one of the great characters of faith that turn up in the book of Hebrews. And what I love about these characters, including Sarah in the book of Hebrews, is there is no mention of the things they got wrong. It doesn't, in Hebrews, God does not hold against these great figures of the text. He doesn't hold against them the poor decisions they made. There's nothing about the jealousy or the envy. There's nothing about the pretense with Hagar, although I suspect that's not all Sarah's fault. There's no mention of any of these things in that part of Hebrews. It just says that Sarah believed the promise of God. And so that's what I want to think of just as we finish. Isn't it incredible that despite our unfaithfulness to God, isn't it incredible despite the mistakes that we make, He doesn't hold it against us? For some reason, because of His character and His love, God remembers the good bits. Isn't that amazing? That when all is said and done, God does not hold on to the mistakes. It says the same of Abraham. It says the same of David. All these very flawed characters that we see in the Old Testament, by the time Hebrews speaks about them as a great cloud of witnesses, it just ignores all the stupidity, all the fear, the poor decisions, the unfaithfulness, and it just records the fact that they believed God, and God honored that. Sarah believed God. She maintained a relationship with Abraham even when it didn't go well for her. And she did that because she believed that the promise was for her as well, that she would be a mother of faith, that she, with Abraham, would bring into the world a son who would bless the nations, who would grow into this great nation. And so I wonder how you think about your own failures. I wonder how you think about your own, the times that you have acted out of fear instead of faith, the mistakes that you've made. Because these Old Testament characters make some massive mistakes, don't they? They're not just little mistakes. I mean, like, how many of you handed your wife over because you were scared of a Pharaoh? These guys made massive mistakes. And yet God was faithful to them, and God remembers their faithfulness and not their sins. What if God could do that for you? What if God could forget your mistakes, though they are many? What if He could forgive your deliberate bad decisions? What if He could forgive the things that you did out of fear that you should never have done? As Christians, we believe that even Abraham and Sarah's sins were forgiven because of Jesus. God is able to forgive and in many ways to forget all that they've done wrong. Even back then, thousands of years ago, as He is able thousands of years later. All this He does through Jesus Christ. Through His Son, He has removed our sins from us as far as east and west are. And they believed the earth was flat. Just as far as east and west are from each other, Jesus has removed Abraham and Sarah's sins and yours and mine. I used to worry about the big screen in heaven playing all your mistakes over and over again for eternity. But I don't think that screen exists. It's forgotten. It's just the good bits. Even if they're brief, it's just the good bits because of what Jesus has done. Amen. Let's pray.